The day had already been too long before the rain started. I'd spent 9 hours staring at spreadsheets that all looked the same, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic clicking of keyboards around me. My supervisor had kept me late to review quarterly projections that could have waited until tomorrow, but she had this way of making everything sound urgent, like the fate of the company rested on whether I could reconcile a $3 discrepancy in the office supplies budget. By the time I finally escaped the building, the sun was already gone, swallowed by thick clouds that had been gathering all afternoon like a slow-moving thread. The air felt heavy and electric, the way it does before storms, pressing against my skin with a humidity that made my shirt stick to my back. I should have noticed the signs, should have grabbed an umbrella from the lost and found, or called a rideshare, or done any of the sensible things that people with functioning brains do when the sky looks like it's about to split open. Instead, I walked to the bus stop like I always did, my mind somewhere else entirely, thinking about the call I'd gotten from my mom that morning asking when I was going to visit, her voice carrying that particular note of loneliness that made my chest tight, thinking about the apartment I was going back to with its leaky faucet and the neighbor who played music too loud, and the stack of bills on my kitchen counter that I'd been avoiding for 3 days. I wasn't thinking about the weather at all. The first drops hit my forehead as I rounded the corner onto 5th Street, fat and warm and surprising. I looked up at the sky, really looked at it for the first time all day, and saw clouds so dark they were almost purple, rolling across the cityscape like something alive and hungry. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of rain and wet concrete and something else, something sharp and clean that made me think of childhood summers and the way my grandmother's garden used to smell right before a storm. I quickened my pace, but it was already too late. The sky opened up like someone had torn a hole in it, and suddenly I was running, my work shoes slapping against the sidewalk as the rain came down in sheets. It was the kind of downpour that soaks you through in seconds, that makes umbrellas useless and turns streets into rivers, the kind of rain that feels personal, like the universe has decided to single you out for punishment. The bus stop appeared ahead of me like salvation, a small glass and metal shelter that looked pathetically inadequate against the fury of the storm, but it was something. I sprinted the last 50 yards, my messenger bag bouncing against my hip, my white dress shirt already clinging to my skin like a second, unwelcome layer. I ducked under the narrow overhang just as a flash of lightning illuminated the entire street in stark electric blue. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing hard and dripping onto the concrete floor. The sound of the rain against the metal roof was deafening, a constant drumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I pushed my wet hair back from my forehead and tried to wring some of the water from my shirt, but it was hopeless. I was soaked through, probably looked like I'd fallen into a lake, and the bus schedule posted on the wall told me I had at least 20 minutes to wait. I was fumbling for my phone to check if the buses were running late, though in weather like this, they probably weren't running at all, when I heard footsteps splashing rapidly toward the shelter. I looked up just in time to see another figure burst through the curtain of rain, stumbling slightly as he made it under the overhang and immediately began shaking water from his dark hair like a dog. He was breathing hard, the way I was, his chest rising and falling beneath a gray t-shirt that was plastered to his body. His jeans were dark with water, and his sneakers made small squelching sounds against the concrete as he moved further into the shelter. He ran his hands through his hair again, sending droplets flying, and that's when he looked at me. And everything stopped. It wasn't dramatic, not the way it happens in movies where time literally freezes and orchestral music swells in the background. It was quieter than that, more subtle. But something shifted in the air between us, something I couldn't name but could definitely feel. Maybe it was just the way his eyes caught mine and held them for a beat longer than strangers usually do. Maybe it was the way he smiled, not the polite, automatic smile you give to someone you're stuck waiting with, but something warmer, more genuine, like he was genuinely amused by the situation we'd both found ourselves in. Or maybe it was just that in that moment, with the rain creating a wall of sound around us and the rest of the world feeling very far away, the small space under the shelter felt strangely intimate, like we were sharing something more significant than just a dry patch of concrete. Jesus, he said, still catching his breath. His voice was deeper than I'd expected, with a slight rasp that made me think he might be a smoker. Where the hell did that come from? I glanced out at the storm, which showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. The wind was howling now, driving the rain sideways so that it bounced off the pavement and back up into the air in a fine mist. The street was already flooded, water rushing along the gutters in fast-moving streams that carried leaves and trash and whatever else the storm had picked up along the way. I don't know, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. I should have been paying more attention to the forecast. He laughed, a short, incredulous sound. Yeah, me too. I was so focused on getting out of work that I didn't even notice how dark it was getting. He gestured to his soaked clothes. Obviously, I found myself studying him as he spoke, trying to place him. There was something familiar about his face, something that made me think I might have seen him before. Maybe on this same bus route, or in the coffee shop near my office, or just walking around the neighborhood. He had the kind of face that would be easy to remember, sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw, dark eyebrows that were currently furrowed in annoyance at his wet condition, and eyes that were either green or gray. I couldn't tell in the dim light of the shelter. He was probably around my age, maybe a year or two older, with a kind of lean build that suggested he was active without being obsessive about it. The wet t-shirt didn't leave much to imagination. I could see the definition of his shoulders and chest, the flat line of his stomach, but it wasn't just his physical appearance that held my attention. There was something about the way he moved, the way he carried himself, that spoke of easy confidence without arrogance, like he was comfortable in his own skin in a way that I envied. You could have run for it, I said, nodding toward the street where the rain continued to pour down in torrents. He followed my gaze and shook his head. And get completely drenched? No thanks. He looked back at me with that same amused smile. Besides, this seemed like the better option. There was something in the way he said it, some subtle emphasis on the word this, that made me wonder if he was talking about more than just the shelter. But before I could analyze it too closely, another crack of thunder rolled overhead, so loud and close that we both jumped slightly. The silence that followed felt different from the one that had come before. We were both still dripping, both still catching our breath, but now there was an awareness between us that hadn't been there initially. an acknowledgement that we were two strangers who had ended up in this small space together, and that somehow that felt significant. I leaned against the back wall of the shelter, trying to give him more room, but also trying to get a better look at him without being obvious about it. The space wasn't large, maybe 6 feet by 4 feet, with a bench that took up most of the width and barely enough height clearance for both of us to stand comfortably. This close, I could smell the rain on his clothes and skin, clean and fresh and somehow comforting. He seemed to be doing his own assessment of the situation, glancing around the shelter and then back at the storm outside. "How long do these usually last?" he asked. "The rain or the wait for the bus?" That earned me another laugh, and I felt something warm unfurl in my chest. "Both, I guess. Well, the bus is supposed to come every 20 minutes, but in weather like this," I shrugged, "could be an hour, could be never." And the storm. I looked out at the street again, watching the way the rain bounced off the pavement and created dozens of small rivers flowing toward the storm drains. Summer storms like this usually blow through pretty quickly, but this one, I paused, watching a trash can get knocked over by the wind. "This one looks like it's settling in for a while." He nodded, accepting this information with what seemed like surprising equanimity. Most people would be frustrated by the delay, checking their phones constantly and pacing around the small space like caged animals. But he just stood there, hands shoved into the pockets of his wet jeans, looking almost relaxed despite the circumstances. "I'm Marcus, by the way," he said suddenly, and I realized we'd been standing there for several minutes without exchanging names. "David." I almost extended my hand for a handshake, then remembered that we were both soaking wet and probably looked ridiculous enough already. Instead, I just nodded. "Nice to meet you, David. Even under these circumstances." He gestured to the storm around us with one hand, and I noticed that his fingers were long and elegant, the kind of hands that suggested he might play piano or guitar. There was a thin silver ring on his right ring finger, simple and unadorned. "Could be worse," I said. "Could be hailing or snowing in July. Hey, you never know, climate change and all that." We fell into another silence, but it was comfortable now, less charged with the uncertainty of not knowing who the other person was. I found myself settling into the situation, accepting that I was going to be here for a while and that I had company. Not unpleasant company either. I watched Marcus as he pulled his phone from his pocket and checked the screen, his brow furrowing as he presumably discovered what I already knew, that the buses were running late if they were running at all. The light from his phone cast his features in sharp relief for a moment, highlighting the strong line of his nose and the curve of his lower lip. "No service," he said, holding up the phone so I could see the blank bars. "You?" I checked my own phone and shook my head. "Same. The storm must be interfering with the towers." He pocketed the phone and looked around the shelter again, this time more slowly, as if he were really seeing it for the first time. The bench was old and slightly rusted, with chipped green paint and what looked like decades of accumulated scratches and graffiti. The walls were covered with the usual collection of bus schedules and public service announcements, most of them curled at the edges and water-stained. Not exactly the most romantic setting, but somehow the shabby surroundings only made our situation feel more real, more grounded. "This is probably the longest I've stood still all day," Marcus said after a moment. "Yeah? Busy day? Aren't they all?" He leaned against the side wall, mirroring my position. "I'm in marketing for a tech startup downtown. You know how it is. Always some crisis, always some deadline, always some reason why everything has to be done yesterday. I nodded. I work in accounting. Different kind of stress, but stress all the same. Accounting. He said it like he was testing the word, seeing how it fit. I bet you're good with numbers. Better than I am with people, usually. I find that hard to believe. There was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something that might have been curiosity or interest or just polite conversation. But the way he was looking at me made me suddenly aware of how close we were standing, how small the space was, how the sound of the rain created a kind of cocoon around us that made everything else feel distant and unimportant. Another flash of lightning lit up the sky, followed almost immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the entire shelter. We both instinctively moved closer to the center of the space, away from the edges where the rain was starting to blow in despite the overhang. That was close, Marcus said, and I realized that our shoulders were almost touching now. Yeah. My voice came out quieter than I'd intended, almost lost in the sound of the storm. We were strangers, just two people hiding from the rain, two people who happened to catch the same bus route and happened to get caught in the same storm. But somehow, it felt like more than that. Like the world had narrowed to this little shelter, this small space we were forced to share, and everything outside the circle of the overhang had ceased to exist. I found myself studying the way the water dripped from his hair, creating small dark spots on his t-shirt. The way his breathing had finally evened out, though I could still see his chest rising and falling beneath the wet fabric. The way he seemed completely unself-conscious about his appearance, even though he was as soaked and bedraggled as I was. There was something appealing about that confidence, that ease with himself. Most of the guys I knew would be complaining about their ruined clothes or their wet shoes or the delay to their evening plans, but Marcus seemed content to just be here in this moment, waiting out the storm. Do you take this bus often? I asked, partly because I was curious and partly because the silence was starting to feel too intimate. Every day for the past six months. Same road, same time, usually the same seat if I can manage it. He paused. I don't think I've seen you before, though. I usually catch the earlier one. Got held up at work today. Lucky you. Lucky? He gestured to the space around us, the storm outside, the situation we'd found ourselves in. If you'd caught your usual bus, you'd already be home, dry and warm, and probably eating dinner by now. True, I considered this, but then I would have missed this. The words came out before I could stop them, and I immediately felt heat rise in my cheeks. It was too forward, too suggestive, especially for two strangers who'd been talking for all of 10 minutes, but Marcus didn't seem to mind. If anything, his smile got a little wider. Yeah, he said softly, that would have been a shame. Another silence fell between us, but this one was different from the others. This one hummed with possibility, with the kind of tension that builds between two people who are starting to realize they're attracted to each other but aren't quite sure what to do about it. I tried to focus on something else. The rain, the schedule posted on the wall, the way the streetlights looked blurred and impressionistic through the curtain of water. But my attention kept drifting back to Marcus, to the way he was looking at me like he was trying to figure something out. Can I ask you something? He said eventually. Sure. Do you believe in fate? The question caught me off guard. Fate? Yeah, like, do you think some things are meant to happen? That sometimes the universe puts you exactly where you need to be, even when it doesn't make sense at the time? I thought about it for a moment, watching the rain continue to pour down with no sign of letting up. I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think there's some kind of plan, some reason for things. But most of the time it just feels random, you know? Like we're all just stumbling around, bumping into each other by accident. But what if it's not an accident? He turned to face me more directly, and I could see that his eyes were definitely green, with little flecks of gold around the pupils. What if this, he gestured to the space between us, what if this is exactly what's supposed to be happening right now? I felt something flutter in my chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the humid air. You think we're supposed to be stuck in a bus shelter together? I think, he said carefully, that out of all the places we could have ended up tonight, all the shelters and doorways and buildings we could have ducked into, we ended up in the same one. And maybe that means something. Before I could respond, another crack of thunder echoed overhead, followed by a flash of lightning that illuminated the entire street in stark white light. For just a moment, I could see everything clearly: the flooded street, the bent trees, the rain coming down so hard it looked like static on an old television. And in that moment of clarity, I could also see Marcus's face clearly, the way he was looking at me with something that might have been hope. The thunder that followed seemed to go on forever, a long, rolling rumble that I felt in my chest as much as I heard with my ears. When it finally faded, the silence seemed even more profound than before. Maybe, I said quietly. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, and I felt like something was shifting between us. Something subtle but significant, like the moment when you realize that a casual conversation has turned into something deeper without you noticing. Marcus broke the silence first. So what do you do when you're not crunching numbers? I laughed. God, that makes me sound boring. I didn't mean it that way. No, it's okay. You're not wrong. I thought about how to answer. I read mostly, cook sometimes, though I'm not very good at it. I've been trying to learn guitar, but my neighbors probably wish I'd give up. Guitar? What kind of music? Nothing fancy, just basic chords, really. I bought this book that's supposed to teach you 50 songs, but I'm still struggling with Wonderwall. That got another laugh from him, and I found myself grinning in response. There was something infectious about his amusement, something that made me want to keep talking just to see him smile. What about you? I asked. Photography mostly, nothing professional, just a hobby. I like taking pictures of the city, architecture, street scenes, people when they don't know they're being watched. That sounds more interesting than guitar lessons. Different kind of interesting, maybe? He paused, considering something. Actually, this would make a great photo, the two of us waiting out the storm. All that rain in the background, the way the light from the street lamps catches the water. It's very cinematic. You think so? Definitely, very film noir. Two strangers thrown together by circumstance, waiting for something that might never come. The bus, you mean? Among other things. There was that subtle emphasis again, that suggestion that we were talking about more than just public transportation. I felt my pulse quicken slightly, that familiar flutter of attraction mixed with nervousness that came from realizing you were in the middle of something that might actually be happening. I glanced out at the street again, looking for any sign that the storm was letting up. But if anything, it seemed to be getting worse. The wind was howling now, bending the trees nearly horizontal and sending debris flying through the air. A plastic bag whipped past the shelter so fast it was just a blur of white against the darkness. Doesn't look like this is stopping anytime soon, I said. Marcus followed my gaze and nodded. Good thing we're not in a hurry. Speak for yourself. I was supposed to meet my friend for dinner an hour ago. Were you looking forward to it? The question surprised me. What do you mean? The dinner. Were you excited about it, or was it one of those things you do because you're supposed to? I thought about Sarah, who I'd been friends with since college, but who I saw maybe once a month now, and our standing dinner dates that had become more obligation than pleasure. We'd run out of things to talk about years ago, but neither of us wanted to admit it, so we kept meeting and making small talk about work and the weather and whatever show we were currently binge watching. Honestly, I said, it was more of a should than a want to. Then maybe this is the universe doing you a favor by trapping me in a bus shelter during a monsoon, by giving you an excuse to do something different. He leaned back against the wall, looking relaxed despite the chaos outside. When's the last time you did something spontaneous? Spontaneous? Yeah, something unplanned. Something just because you wanted to, not because you had to. I tried to remember and came up empty. My life was scheduled down to the 15-minute increment. Work from 8 to 5. Gym on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Groceries on Saturday morning. Laundry on Sunday afternoon. Even my free time was planned, blocked out in my calendar like appointments with myself. I can't remember, I admitted. That's what I thought. He looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. You have that look. What look? Like you're always thinking 3 steps ahead. Like you're trying to solve some problem that hasn't happened yet. He wasn't wrong. Even standing here, supposedly relaxing while we waited out the storm, part of my mind was already calculating how long it would take me to get home, whether I had anything in the refrigerator for dinner, what time I needed to set my alarm for tomorrow morning. Is that bad? Not bad, just limiting maybe. Sometimes the best things happen when you stop planning and just let yourself be wherever you are. As if to punctuate his point, another gust of wind sent a fresh wave of rain under the overhang, and we both had to step closer to the center of the shelter to avoid getting soaked again. This time, we ended up standing close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the rain in his hair and something else underneath it. Soap maybe, or cologne that had mostly washed away but left just a trace of something clean and masculine. Like right now, he said quietly. I looked up and found him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was interest there definitely, but also something gentler. Curiosity maybe. Or patience. Right now? Yeah, right now you're not at that dinner you didn't really want to go to. You're not at home thinking about work tomorrow. You're just here, in this moment, with me. The way he said it made something shift in my chest. He was right. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I wasn't thinking about my schedule or my responsibilities or the dozen small tasks I needed to accomplish before I could consider the day complete. I was just standing in a bus shelter during a thunderstorm, talking to a stranger who was turning out to be much more interesting than I'd expected. And that's a good thing? I asked. I think so. He smiled, and I noticed that one of his front teeth was slightly crooked, just enough to keep him from being conventionally perfect. Somehow that small imperfection made him more attractive, not less. Don't you? Before I could answer, we both became aware of a new sound cutting through the constant drum of rain. Laughter. high and bright and completely incongruous with the weather. We turned toward the street and saw two figures running past the shelter, arms linked, completely soaked and apparently loving every minute of it. They disappeared around the corner, but their laughter lingered in the air like an echo. Marcus and I looked at each other and, without any conscious decision, started laughing too. Not at the couple, exactly, but at the absurdity of it all. The storm, our situation, the fact that some people were choosing to run through the rain while we were hiding from it. Maybe they have the right idea, Marcus said when our laughter died down. Running through a thunderstorm, that's the right idea? Embracing it instead of fighting it. I considered this, watching the water rush past the shelter entrance in rivers that reflected the streetlights like scattered coins. You want to make a run for it? Do you? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized he wasn't just asking about the rain. He was asking about something bigger, something I couldn't quite name, but could definitely feel building in the small space between us. I don't know, I said honestly. That's okay. We've got time to figure it out. And somehow, standing there with the rain pouring down around us and nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait, that felt like exactly the right answer. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, the thunder was getting closer, the lightning more frequent. Each flash illuminated the flooded street in stark detail. Cars moving slowly through water that came up to their wheel wells, pedestrians huddled under inadequate umbrellas, the city transformed into something wild and elemental. But inside our small shelter, the chaos felt distant. We were in our own bubble, protected from the worst of it, and somehow that made everything else seem manageable, possible even. Marcus was right. Maybe it wasn't so bad waiting. In fact, as I watched him lean back against the wall, completely at ease despite being soaked to the skin, as I listened to him hum quietly under his breath some song I didn't recognize, as I felt the strange but not unpleasant tension that was building between us with each passing minute, I was starting to think that maybe this was exactly where I was supposed to be. The rain drummed against the roof of the shelter, steady and hypnotic, and neither of us made any move to leave. Outside, the world rushed past in blurred streaks of light and shadow. But inside, time seemed to slow, to stretch, to give us space to discover whatever this was that was happening between us. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere else. Maybe it's not so bad, Marcus said softly, echoing my thoughts. Waiting. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something click into place. Something I hadn't even realized was missing until this moment, until this strange and unexpected encounter that the storm had given us. No, I said, surprised by how much I meant it. It's not bad at all. The rain continued to fall, and we continued to wait, and somehow that felt like exactly the beginning of something I'd been looking for, without knowing I was looking for anything at all. Part 2. 3 days later, I was still thinking about the rain, not the inconvenience of it, or the way it had ruined my shoes, or even the dinner I'd missed with Sarah, who had been surprisingly understanding when I finally managed to text her from the shelter, telling her I was stranded and would have to reschedule. No, I was thinking about the way the storm had felt like a gift, wrapping Marcus and me in its chaos and giving us permission to exist in that small space together without explanation or apology. I kept replaying moments from that evening, the way he'd laughed when I'd made some self-deprecating comment about my accounting job, the careful way he'd moved closer when the rain started blowing sideways into the shelter, the quiet intensity in his voice when he'd asked if I believed in fate. Most of all, I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me in those final moments before the bus had finally arrived, like he was memorizing something he didn't want to forget. The bus had been nearly empty when it pulled up, its headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights. We'd climbed aboard together, water dripping from our clothes onto the rubber floor mats, and I'd expected us to sit together, to continue whatever conversation the storm had started. Instead, Marcus had paused in the aisle, given me that same crooked smile that had already begun haunting my dreams, and said, "This is where I usually sit," gesturing to a seat near the front. I'd nodded and made my way toward the back, hyper-aware of the distance between us, but not sure how to bridge it. We were strangers again, passengers on the same route, and the intimate bubble the storm had created around us had burst the moment we stepped onto that brightly lit bus. But I'd felt his eyes on me during the ride, and when I'd stolen glances toward the front, I'd caught him looking back more than once. When his stop had come, 3 before mine, he'd stood and walked past my seat, pausing just long enough to say, "See you around, David," in a voice so quiet I might have imagined it. I'd watched through the rain-streaked window as he jogged toward a building I didn't recognize, his figure becoming smaller and more indistinct until he disappeared through a doorway and was gone. And then I'd spent the rest of the ride home wondering if I'd ever see him again, if that single evening had been a beginning or an ending, if the universe that had supposedly brought us together had any intention of doing it twice. The wondering followed me through the rest of the week. I found myself taking the same bus at the same time, even though it meant staying late at work for no real reason. I lingered at the coffee shop near the office, scanning the faces of everyone who walked through the door. I even went back to that bus shelter one evening when the forecast had called for scattered showers, standing there like an idiot for 20 minutes while nothing but a light drizzle fell around me. It was pathetic, and I knew it. I was a grown man mooning over a stranger I'd talked to for maybe an hour, reading meaning into what had probably been nothing more than polite conversation between two people stuck in an unfortunate situation. Marcus had probably forgotten about me the moment he'd stepped off that bus. He probably struck up conversations with strangers all the time. He probably had a boyfriend or a husband or a complicated relationship status that would make my interest both unwelcome and irrelevant. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd said my name, or the questions he'd asked about fate and spontaneity, or the moment when he'd suggested that maybe the universe had put us exactly where we needed to be. There had been something in his voice, something in the way he'd looked at me that felt like more than idle conversation, something that felt like possibility. By Friday afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself to let it go. Almost. I was sitting at my desk, staring at a spreadsheet that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all the attention I was paying to it, when my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Coffee tomorrow?" "That place on 5th Street you like." I stared at the message for a moment, trying to remember what place on 5th Street she was talking about. Then it hit me. The little cafe 3 blocks from the bus stop where Marcus and I had waited out the storm. The one with the mismatched chairs and the barista who drew elaborate foam art that was almost too pretty to drink. Sure, I texted back. What time? 2 p.m.? Perfect. I put my phone away and tried to focus on the spreadsheet again, but my mind kept drifting to the cafe, to the possibility, however remote, that Marcus might be there too. It was ridiculous, of course. The chances of running into him at the exact place and time I happened to be there were astronomical. The city had hundreds of coffee shops, thousands probably. Just because this one was in the same neighborhood didn't mean anything. But as I walked down Fifth Street the next afternoon, I found myself scanning every face I passed, my pulse quickening every time I saw someone with dark hair or a familiar silhouette. By the time I reached the cafe, my nerves were so taut I felt like I might jump out of my skin at the smallest provocation. Sarah was already there, sitting at a small table near the window with 2 cups in front of her. She waved when she saw me, her blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight, and I made my way over to her, trying to shake off the strange anticipation that had been building all day. "You look tired," she said by way of greeting, which was Sarah's version of hello. She'd never been one for small talk. "Thanks, you look great too." I sat down across from her and picked up the cup she'd ordered for me, a cappuccino with foam art that looked like a leaf or maybe a feather. "Long week." "Aren't they all?" She took a sip of what looked like an iced latte, even though it was barely 60 degrees outside. Sarah had always been immune to weather. "How was your dinner disaster on Tuesday? Did you ever make it out of that storm?" Eventually, I found myself smiling at the memory, which probably looked strange given that I was talking about being stranded in a thunderstorm. "It wasn't so bad, actually." "Really? Because when you texted me, you sounded pretty miserable." Had I? I tried to remember what I'd written, but all I could recall was the urgency I'd felt to let her know I wouldn't make it. The way my fingers had shaken slightly as I typed on my phone while Marcus stood just a few feet away, probably wondering who I was texting. "I guess it turned out better than I expected," I said. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Better how?" Before I could answer, the bell above the cafe door chimed, and I glanced up out of habit, the same way I'd been glancing up every time someone entered a room for the past 3 days. And there, silhouetted in the doorway like something out of a dream, was Marcus. He was wearing a different shirt this time, navy blue instead of gray, and his hair was dry and styled instead of plastered to his head with rain. But there was no mistaking the sharp line of his cheekbones, the easy way he moved as he stepped into the cafe and looked around for a table. And when his eyes found mine across the room, that same crooked smile spread across his face like sunrise. My heart stopped, actually stopped, for what felt like a full second before starting up again at double speed. "David?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I started to speak, but Marcus was already walking toward our table, his expression somewhere between amused and pleased, and I couldn't seem to form coherent sentences. "Funny seeing you here again," he said when he reached us, and there was something in his tone, a warmth, a familiarity, that made it clear this wasn't the kind of coincidence you brush off with polite small talk. "Yeah," I managed, my voice coming out rougher than I'd intended. "Funny." Sarah looked back and forth between us, her journalistic instincts clearly pinging. "Should I be introducing myself, or are you two going to keep staring at each other like teenagers?" Heat flooded my cheeks, but Marcus just laughed. "Sorry, I'm Marcus. David and I met the other night during that storm." "The storm that ruined your dinner plans?" Sarah's eyebrow climbed higher. Interesting. Marcus glanced at the empty chair at our table, then back at me. I don't want to interrupt. I was just going to grab a coffee and... Don't be ridiculous, Sarah said before I could respond. She was already pulling out the chair, her expression shifting into the mode she used when she was interviewing someone for a story. Sit. I want to hear about this mysterious storm encounter. Sarah, I started, but Marcus was already sitting down, looking perfectly at ease despite having been ambushed by my clearly nosy best friend. It wasn't mysterious, he said, settling into the chair with that same natural confidence I remembered from the bus shelter. Just two people getting caught in the rain at the same time. Sarah signaled the barista for another coffee, and now you're both here at the same cafe at the same time? That's quite a coincidence. Maybe the rain knew what it was doing, Marcus said, and his eyes found mine as he spoke. Something warm unfurled in my chest at the words, at the memory they conjured of standing in that small shelter while the world raged around us. He'd remembered our conversation about fate, about the universe putting people where they needed to be, which meant he'd been thinking about that night too. I should probably go, Sarah announced suddenly, standing up and gathering her purse. I just remembered I have a thing. What thing? I asked, though I was grateful for her diplomatic exit, even as I dreaded being alone with Marcus. Well, not alone exactly. We were in a crowded cafe, but without the buffer of Sarah's presence. A very important thing that definitely can't wait. She leaned down and kissed my cheek, then whispered in my ear, "He's cute. Don't screw this up." Louder, she added, "Nice meeting you, Marcus. Take care of my friend." And then she was gone, leaving her barely touched iced latte and a wake of expensive perfume and mischief. Marcus watched her leave, then turned back to me with obvious amusement. "Subtle friend you have there. She's a journalist. Subtlety isn't really in her skill set." I wrapped my hands around my cappuccino cup, grateful for something to do with them. Sorry about the ambush. I don't mind. Though I have to ask, was this planned? What? No. The denial came out too quickly, too forcefully. I mean, I had no idea you'd be here. Sarah suggested this place, and I trailed off, realizing how defensive I sounded. Marcus was watching me with that same patient expression I remembered from the bus shelter, like he was perfectly willing to wait for me to finish my thought, however long it took. "You what?" he prompted gently. I took a breath, tried to find some semblance of honesty. "I've been thinking about Tuesday night, about our conversation, and I guess I was hoping I might see you again." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, maybe, or pleasure. "Really? Really? Which is crazy because I don't usually..." I gestured vaguely, trying to encompass the strangeness of the situation. I don't usually think about strangers I meet at bus stops, even strangers who trap you in thunderstorms, especially strangers who trap me in thunderstorms. I found myself smiling despite my nervousness. That should be a red flag, right? Probably. He leaned back in his chair, more relaxed now. Good thing I didn't actually control the weather. The barista appeared with Marcus's coffee, something dark and strong smelling that came in a plain white cup. He thanked her and took a sip, wincing slightly at the heat. "So," he said after a moment, "here we are again. Here we are. Different circumstances this time. Definitely drier, less dramatic." Speak for yourself. Sarah's exit was pretty theatrical. That earned me another laugh, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease. This was easier than I'd expected, falling back into conversation with him, almost as if the storm had broken more than just the weather between us. It had broken through whatever barriers usually kept me from talking to attractive strangers about anything more substantial than the weather. She seems like a good friend, Marcus said. The best, even when she's being insufferably matchmaker-y. Is that what she was doing? Wasn't it obvious? The sudden departure, the meaningful looks, the not so subtle suggestion that you take care of me? Marcus considered this. I thought she was just being polite. Sarah is never just polite. She has an agenda for everything, including my love life. The words were out before I could stop them, and I immediately wanted to take them back. Too much information, too fast, too presumptuous. But Marcus didn't seem bothered by the implication. And what's her agenda for your love life? That I should have one, apparently. I took a larger gulp of cappuccino than was wise and felt the foam stick to my upper lip. She thinks I spend too much time at work and not enough time meeting people. Do you? Spend too much time at work? Definitely. Not enough time meeting people? I wiped the foam from my lip with my napkin, buying myself a moment to think. I used to think I was fine with the way things were. Quiet life, predictable routine, no complications. I paused, looking at him across the table. But then Tuesday happened, and now I'm sitting in a cafe with someone I barely know, talking about things I don't usually talk about, and it doesn't feel strange at all. Something warm flickered in his eyes. It doesn't, does it? We fell into a comfortable silence, sipping our coffees and watching the afternoon foot traffic through the cafe's large front window. It was a beautiful day, warm but not humid, with the kind of clear blue sky that only appears after storms have washed all the dust and haze from the air. The complete opposite of Tuesday evening, but somehow this felt like a continuation of that conversation rather than something entirely new. Can I ask you something? Marcus said eventually. Of course. When you said you'd been thinking about Tuesday night, what were you thinking? It was a fair question, but not an easy one to answer. How could I explain the way that single hour had lodged itself in my memory like a splinter? How could I describe the way I'd found myself looking for his face in crowds, listening for his voice in coffee shop conversations, checking the weather forecast with an intensity that bordered on obsessive? I kept thinking about what you said, I began slowly. About fate and the universe putting people where they need to be. And I kept wondering if you were right. And I kept wondering if I'd ever find out. He nodded as if this made perfect sense. I've been thinking about it too. About you, I mean, about that night. The admission sent a flutter of warmth through my chest. Really? Really, I kept taking the same bus, same time, hoping I might see you again. Started drinking my coffee at different places along your route. He gestured to the cafe around us. This was actually the third place I'd tried today. You were looking for me? I was hoping, he corrected. There's a difference. But there wasn't, not really, and we both knew it. He'd been looking for me the same way I'd been looking for him, with the same desperate hope disguised as casual routine. The realization made me feel less pathetic about my own behavior and more amazed by the coincidence that had brought us together again. So Sarah suggesting this place, I started, was either the universe's idea of a joke, or maybe she's more perceptive than you give her credit for. Probably both. I finished my cappuccino and set the empty cup down. suddenly aware that we'd been sitting here for over an hour and I had no desire to leave. Do you have somewhere you need to be? Marcus checked his watch, a simple silver piece that caught the light as he moved his wrist. Not until tonight. You? Nowhere important. He smiled, and I noticed again the way that one slightly crooked tooth kept him from looking too perfect. Good, because I was hoping we could walk around a little. If you want to. I wanted to. More than I could have explained. More than made rational sense, given that I still barely knew him, but something about the way he'd asked, casual but hopeful, giving me room to say no without making it awkward, made me realize that this was exactly what I'd been hoping would happen if I ever saw him again. I'd like that, I said. We left the cafe together, stepping out into the warm afternoon air. The street was busy with weekend foot traffic, couples walking hand in hand, families with strollers, groups of friends heading to or from whatever adventures Saturday had brought them. But I barely noticed any of it. My attention was focused entirely on Marcus as he walked beside me, close enough that our shoulders occasionally brushed, far enough away that it didn't feel presumptuous. So, he said as we turned onto a tree-lined side street I'd never explored before, tell me something I don't know about you. Like what? Anything. Something that didn't come up during our storm confession session. I thought about it as we walked past a row of brownstones with flower boxes in their windows. I'm afraid of elevators. Really? Completely irrational phobia. I can ride in them if I have to, but I hate every second of it. How do you manage at work? Office building? 12 flights of stairs every morning. My colleagues think I'm incredibly dedicated to fitness. Marcus laughed. That's actually kind of admirable. Most people would just deal with the fear. Most people would probably get over the fear. I've had it since I was a kid and never bothered to do anything about it. I glanced at him as we paused at a crosswalk. What about you? Any irrational fears I should know about? Butterflies? Butterflies? I know how it sounds. They're supposed to be beautiful, delicate, all that, but there's something about the way they move, so unpredictable, so fluttery. Gives me the creeps. That's actually hilarious. Thanks for your support in my time of vulnerability. The light changed and we crossed the street, falling back into step as we continued down the sidewalk. The conversation flowed easily between us, touching on everything and nothing. Favorite movies, childhood pets, the best pizza in the city, why people put pineapple on pizza and whether that should be considered a crime against humanity. It was the kind of rambling, meandering talk that happens when two people are genuinely interested in each other, when the goal isn't to get somewhere specific but just to keep the conversation going as long as possible. I found myself paying attention not just to what Marcus said, but to how he said it, the way his voice got softer when he talked about his photography, the animated gestures he made when he was explaining something he was passionate about, the comfortable silences that fell between topics without feeling awkward. We'd been walking for almost an hour when we found ourselves in a small park I'd never noticed before, despite living in this neighborhood for 3 years. It was tucked between two apartment buildings like a secret, with a few benches arranged around a fountain that looked like it had been there since the city was founded. I've never seen this place before, I said, looking around at the carefully maintained flower beds and the old trees that provided shade despite the late afternoon sun. It's easy to miss. I only found it because I was taking pictures of that building. He pointed to one of the surrounding structures and saw the entrance from this angle. We sat down on one of the benches close enough that I could smell his cologne, something clean and subtle that reminded me of cedar and rain. The fountain burbled softly beside us, and somewhere overhead, birds were having what sounded like a very important conversation. "This is nice," I said, settling back against the bench. "Better than a bus shelter?" "Different, but nice in its own way." Marcus turned slightly so he was facing me more directly. "Can I ask you something else?" "Sure." "When you were sitting in that cafe today before I showed up, were you disappointed that I wasn't there?" The question caught me off guard with its directness, its assumption that I'd been looking